Have you ever posted something in a group chat? Maybe your kid got a full-ride scholarship, or your spouse surprised you with a designer bag after years of grinding, and watched the read receipts climb while the chat stayed dead silent for 30 minutes straight, until someone finally changed the subject entirely, as if your message never existed, leaving you lying in bed that night wondering why you ever shared anything at all, feeling that strange cold sting of regret mixed with confusion, asking yourself whether you were showing off or just trying to share a moment of joy with people you thought were your friends. That feeling right there is the starting point of everything we need to talk about today, because if you have ever experienced that icy silence, that invisible wall that drops the moment you share good news, then you already know, even if you cannot yet put it into words, that something deeply psychological and profoundly human is happening beneath the surface, something that, if left unchecked, will not just rob you of friendships but will actively endanger your peace, your relationships, and even your financial security as you move into the later chapters of your life. Let us get into it immediately because this is not about guilt-tripping you or making you feel bad for being successful. This is about arming you with the psychological awareness to protect everything you have built without losing the people who matter most along the way. The core truth we need to confront first comes from American social psychologist Leon Festinger and his social comparison theory, which tells us that human beings are hardwired to measure themselves against people they perceive as being in a similar position in life. And when that measurement feels balanced, we experience a comforting sense of solidarity and belonging, but the instant one person in a peer group signals that they have pulled ahead, whether through money, status, or family success, the brains of everyone else in that group do not simply register neutral information, they register a threat, an attack on their own self-concept. And this is not a flaw in character, it is baked into our evolutionary wiring because for hundreds of thousands of years, relative status within a tribe determined access to resources, mates, and survival itself. So when your neighbor or your old college roommate suddenly flashes a new luxury car or brags about their kid getting into an Ivy League school, the ancient alarm system in your limbus fires off signals that say my position is under threat, and the modern social response to that alarm is not to throw a spear but to withdraw, gossip, or sabotage, which brings us to the story of a woman we will call Karen. A 52-year-old mom from a suburb outside of Atlanta who spent decades raising her kids, putting her own dreams on hold, and quietly building a life alongside a tight-knit group of friends from her church and her neighborhood. And when her daughter married a successful surgeon, Karen was over the moon, understandably so, and she started mentioning it everywhere, talking about the gifts her son-in-law sent, the vacations he funded, the supplements he recommended for her health. And in Karen's mind, this was just sharing her happiness with women who had known her for 20-plus years. Women who had seen her struggle through a difficult divorce, watched her work double shifts, held her hand through her mother's funeral. But here is what actually happened behind her back. A separate group chat was created without her, and in that chat the tone was vicious. Comments like good for her daughter, but Karen acts like she married the doctor herself, and she never shuts up about that son-in-law. Must be nice to finally have money through someone else's work. And within 6 months Karen went from being the heart of her social circle to being the person everyone politely avoided, the one whose calls went to voicemail, whose invitations to brunch got met with sorry, I am busy that day. And Karen could feel the shift but could not understand it because in her mind she had done nothing wrong. She had simply shared her joy, and that is the devastating trap of social comparison theory in action. Your joy, when broadcast repeatedly to people who are struggling or stagnant, becomes a mirror that reflects their insecurities back at them, and rather than sit with that discomfort, they will remove the mirror, which means removing you. This is not a judgment on Karen or on anyone who has found themselves in her position. It is a recognition that human social dynamics operate on invisible rules that no one teaches us in school, and the most dangerous of those rules is this: the people closest to you in status are the ones most threatened by your rise. Not strangers, not people far above or below you, but the ones right beside you, because they are the ones who can no longer tell themselves a comfortable story about why their life looks the way it does when your success challenges that narrative. The second psychological principle that makes bragging about money so dangerous, especially as we get older, comes from Alfred Adler and his concept of the superiority complex, which is one of the most misunderstood ideas in popular psychology because people assume a superiority complex means someone genuinely believes they are better than everyone else, but Adler's actual insight was the opposite. He argued that people who chronically display superiority, who cannot stop signaling their wealth or status or achievements, are almost always compensating for a deep and unresolved feeling of inferiority, a wound that never properly healed, and the display is not confidence. It is a desperate plea disguised as a flex. It is the psychological equivalent of screaming, "Please see me. Please validate me. Please tell me I matter because I cannot tell myself." Consider the story of a woman we will call Jennifer, 48 years old, living in Scottsdale, Arizona, whose husband built a very successful commercial real estate business over 15 years. And when the money started flowing in a way it never had before, Jennifer developed a habit she did not even recognize as a habit. Every time she met someone for coffee or dinner, she would place her luxury car keys face up on the table. She would casually mention that her new SUV was so sensitive on the road that it was almost tiring to drive. She would drop brand names into conversation the way other people drop weather observations, and every single time someone's eyes went wide or they said, "Wow, that is amazing," Jennifer felt a hit of something warm in her chest, a momentary sense of worth. But here is what Adler would tell us about Jennifer. That warmth was not self-esteem. It was a borrowed feeling that evaporated the moment she was alone again, and so she needed another hit and another, and the cycle accelerated until Jennifer's reputation in her community shifted from successful wife to the woman who will not stop talking about money. And that reputation attracted exactly the wrong kind of attention. Distant relatives she had not heard from in years suddenly calling with business proposals, acquaintances asking for loans with guilt trip language like "I thought we were closer than that," and outright con artists who smelled vulnerability, because here is a truth that people rarely discuss openly. When you advertise your wealth, you are not just inviting envy, you are painting a target on your back for every predator in your ecosystem. From the manipulative family member to the financial scammer to the so-called friend who sees your generosity as a weakness to exploit. Jennifer found herself in a nightmare. If she said yes to loan requests, her retirement savings eroded. If she said no, people called her selfish and changed behind her back. And either way, she had lost control of the narrative, because once you tell the world you have money, you cannot untell them, you cannot put that genie back in the bottle, and every future interaction becomes colored by the question of what does this person actually want from me, which is a lonely and exhausting way to live, especially in your 50s when what you actually need is peace, trust, and genuine connection, not a social life that feels like a series of transactions. The lesson Adler teaches us here is brutal but liberating. If you find yourself needing to tell people about your success, that need itself is the signal that something inside you still feels unworthy. And the fix is never more applause from the outside. The fix is doing the inner work to arrive at a place where you know your own value without requiring a single other human being to confirm it. And that is not easy work, it is not Instagram-friendly work, it is slow and quiet and sometimes painful, but it is the only path to genuine, durable self-worth that no one can take from you regardless of what they say or do not say in a group chat. The third framework we need to understand comes from Edward Deci and Richard Ryan's self-determination theory, which has been validated in hundreds of studies across dozens of cultures over 40 years of research. And the core finding is this: human beings who pursue external validation, praise, admiration, envy from others, status symbols, experience temporary spikes in happiness that crash quickly and leave them needing more, while human beings who pursue intrinsic satisfaction, personal growth, meaningful relationships, autonomy, mastery of skills they care about, build a kind of happiness that is stable, resilient, and self-sustaining. And this distinction becomes absolutely critical in midlife, because the 40s and 50s are when many Americans finally achieve the financial stability they chased for decades. And there is an enormous temptation in that moment to finally get the recognition you feel you deserve, to finally show the world that all those years of sacrifice paid off. But self-determination theory warns us that this path is a trap dressed up as a reward. Because the more you orient your happiness around other people's reactions to your success, the more fragile your happiness becomes, since you have handed the remote control of your emotional life to people who have absolutely no obligation to press the buttons you want them to press. A woman we will call Diane, 55, from a suburb outside of Chicago, spent her entire adult life measuring her worth by external markers: her children's achievements, her home's curb appeal, her husband's job title, the reaction she got when she shared updates about any of these things. And for decades it sort of worked because there was always a next milestone to share, always another hit of validation around the corner. But then her kids grew up and moved away, her husband retired and became quieter, and suddenly Diane was looking in the mirror at a woman she did not recognize. A woman who had spent 30 years constructing an elaborate exterior, but had never built an interior, never cultivated hobbies or passions or friendships that existed independent of status performance. And the loneliness that hit her was not the loneliness of isolation. She still had people around. It was the far more devastating loneliness of being surrounded by people who only know the version of you that you performed, not the real you, because the real you was never developed, never given oxygen, never allowed to exist without being useful or impressive. And Diane told a therapist that even when people said, "Oh, you must be so proud," or "Wow, you have such a beautiful life," the warmth lasted less than 60 seconds before the emptiness rushed back in. And she realized she had become addicted to a drug that no longer worked at any dose. This is the fate that awaits anyone who builds their identity on external validation rather than internal grounding. And it is particularly cruel in midlife because by the time you recognize the pattern, you may have already alienated genuine connections and surrounded yourself with people who relate to your image rather than your soul. So what do we actually do with all of this information? Because awareness without action is just sophisticated suffering, and I refuse to leave you with a diagnosis and no prescription. The first practice is something I call the listening Sabbath. Choose at least 3 days per week where you make a conscious decision that in any social interaction, you will not talk about yourself, your family's achievements, or your financial situation at all. Not because those things are shameful, but because you are training a new muscle, the muscle of being valued for your presence rather than your announcements. And on those days you give 90% of the conversational space to the other person. You ask questions, you reflect back what they say. You validate their experiences, and what happens over time is remarkable. People begin to describe you as someone with depth, someone with class, someone who makes them feel heard, and you achieve the exact thing you wanted all along, which is to be valued. Except now you are valued for something sustainable and real rather than for information that breeds envy. The second practice is what researchers call selective solitude. Deliberately spending time alone doing things that bring you joy without any audience whatsoever, no social media posts, no photos to share later, no mental drafting of how you will describe this experience to someone else. Just pure unwitnessed living. And this is harder than it sounds because many of us have trained ourselves to experience pleasure only when it is observed and validated by others. But the practice of enjoying something solely for yourself, a quiet morning walk, a cup of coffee on the porch at sunrise, a book that no one will ask you about, rebuilds the neural pathways of intrinsic motivation and teaches your brain that you do not need an audience to feel alive. The third practice is strategic understatement, and this is perhaps the most practically useful tool for navigating social situations where money inevitably comes up. Rather than volunteering information about your financial position, you develop a set of deflection phrases that communicate humility and solidarity. Things like, "Oh, you know how it is between taxes and insurance and everything going up. We are just trying to keep our heads above water like everyone else, and this is not dishonesty, it is social intelligence." It is the recognition that in a world where most people are struggling or anxious about money, broadcasting your comfort creates distance rather than connection. And distance is the last thing any of us needs as we age, because study after study shows that the single greatest predictor of health, happiness, and longevity in older adults is not wealth, it is the quality of their social connections, which means that every time you brag about money and lose a friend, you are not just losing a social contact, you are statistically shortening your own life and reducing your own future happiness, which makes silence not just a virtue but a survival strategy. Let me bring this all together with a final thought that I want you to carry with you beyond this moment. The autumn of life is not the time to display your leaves. It is the time to send your energy down into the roots, because roots are what hold you steady when the winter storms come. And they always come in the form of health scares, losses, transitions, loneliness, and a person with deep roots, meaning genuine self-knowledge, authentic relationships, and internal peace, can weather anything, while a person with a spectacular canopy and shallow roots topples at the first strong wind. Your wealth, your family's success, your comfortable life. These are beautiful things, and you deserve every bit of them after everything you have endured and built. But they do not need to be announced to be real. They do not need witnesses to have value. And the moment you fully internalize this truth is the moment you step into a kind of freedom that no amount of money can buy, the freedom of being so secure in who you are that the opinions of others become background noise rather than the soundtrack of your life. If anything in this resonated with you, if you felt that recognition in your chest that says, yes, I have done this, or yes, I have felt this, then take one small action right now. Not for anyone else, not to perform growth or wisdom for an audience, but for yourself, and simply decide, from today forward, I choose my own peace over anyone else's perception. I choose depth over display. I choose roots over leaves. And I choose the quiet dignity of knowing my own worth without needing a single other person to confirm it. That is not just psychology. That is the foundation of a truly elegant life, and you deserve nothing less.